And with those notes, you probably already know who we're talking about. Ludwig van Beethoven. The opening theme from Symphony No. 5 is probably one of the most recognizable themes in all of classical music. We're going to talk about Beethoven in a chapter all of his own. Now, we finished up with the classic period, and after Beethoven we'll have the Romantic period. But Beethoven was born in 1770 and died in 1827. Now, he has not got a period of his own just because he lives in two different periods. Now, that could be happen with any period that we have. But Beethoven was the epitome of the classic period in his early music, yet he could not be held to the classic period in his music, and he became the father of the Romantic period. Beethoven had a lot, and we're going to do basically two quick videos here, one about his life and the other about his music. Beethoven, have you ever known someone who was really a genius, but not necessarily a good student? That was Beethoven. You probably said, maybe that's me. Well, but Beethoven was like that. He wasn't that good at math, he wasn't that good at English, but he was a genius at music. But he had a very interesting family life. I mentioned he was born in 1770. Now, Mozart, of course, was born in 1756, so Beethoven was about 14 years behind him. Beethoven was in a musical family. His grandfather was a musician. His grandfather had his same name, Ludwig van Beethoven. But his father, Johann Beethoven, he was also a musician, but he had some severe problems with alcoholism. And he wanted his son Beethoven to be a prodigy, just like Mozart had been, and sort of living his dream out through his son Ludwig. Well, he would come home from drinking at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe have a few friends with him, and he would get young Beethoven up out of bed in the middle of the night and beat him and make him practice it, or if his friends were there, make him perform for his friends. So this is the kind of environment that Beethoven grew up in. It's fortunate that we even have any music, that Beethoven didn't just turn totally away from music because of his upbringing, but instead he was motivated to become a great musician. Now, I said he was not a child prodigy like Mozart, but by the time he was a young adult, he was indeed a very excellent musician. When he was about 20 years old, and he lived in Bonn, Germany, Franz Joseph Haydn was leaving Vienna and going to London for a couple of years. And on the way, he happened to pass through Bonn, and he met Beethoven and heard him play the piano. And he agreed, when I get back from London, I will teach you. And so a couple of years passed, and so now Franz Joseph Haydn had returned from London to Vienna, and Beethoven moved to Vienna. By now he's about 22 years old, and he was going to study with Haydn. Well, being the great individualist that he was, he learned quickly from Haydn, but the sessions ended after not too long of a time because he was just too much of an individualist. Haydn was the premier composer of the classic period, and he was very familiar with all the forms, the sonata form, the minuet form, the rondo form, and his music, if you look at it, fits all those forms. And if you look at Beethoven's early music, it also fits those early forms. Yet he wanted to expand, and so he ended up leaving Haydn, and he still stayed in Vienna, and for about 10 years he was a performer and teacher of several students there in Vienna. About 10 years later, Beethoven was now about 32 years old. He began to go deaf. Now, going deaf to a musician is like becoming crippled to a football player. It not only messes up your career, but your whole life is wrapped up around your abilities. And so Beethoven, at that point, 32 years old, going deaf, he began to basically get very depressed, and he got even suicidal. He wrote a letter that was not found until 25 years later when he did finally die, but in this letter he wrote to his brother. He was talking about how he was going to kill himself. But then later in the very same letter, he said, no, because if I kill myself, who will write this music that only I can write? So instead of killing himself, he did exactly the opposite. He threw himself totally into his music. He would go for days and days without even eating because he would be so busy, wrapped up in his room, writing and writing and writing. A lot of people had trouble relating to Beethoven socially because he was so wrapped up in his music. He's said to have walked around in the rain without a coat on, humming and making up themes in his head, and oblivious to those around him. Yet he was just consumed with his music. There are about 60 places in Vienna where if you go there today, you can see a little plaque on different houses and places where it says Beethoven lived here, and Beethoven lived here, and Beethoven lived here. It seemed in just a period of years, he every several months or a year at the most, he would switch a different place. So he was a very transient person for a while. Prince Lichnowsky recognized his genius, and so he gave him a place to live with the promise that Beethoven would actually play music for him for his parties. And Beethoven took him up on the offer to have room and board, but at the same time quite often would refuse to play for the prince. And one time there was another prince who was coming to visit, and they asked Beethoven to come play, and Beethoven's response was very simple. He says, there are hundreds of princes, but there's only one Beethoven. Tell him I don't have time. So that tells you a little bit about his personality. But anyway, for the next 10 years, as he was going deaf, he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote to try to get all the music written as he could before he was deaf. Then there came another personal situation in his life. Beethoven's brother died, and he had a son, late teenage son, who was he left custody to not only Beethoven, but not to his, half the custody was to Beethoven and half the custody was to his widow and the boy's mother. Well, Beethoven wanted full custody of this child because he had never married, never had a child of his own. And so for a period of 5 years, Beethoven was involved in a large court battle and eventually gained custody of his nephew. Ironically, but during that time he did not write any music, or very little music. Ironically, his nephew was treated so harshly by Beethoven that he went out and tried to commit suicide. And when he was unsuccessful in that, he at least said, like, I can't live with my mother, I don't want to live with my uncle, and he went and joined the army just to get away from home. Well, after that happened, Beethoven finally immersed himself back in his music, and around 1824 he wrote his Ninth Symphony. Now his Ninth Symphony, which was his last, was he wrote the entire thing while he was 100% deaf. He never heard a note with his physical ears, yet he heard every note inside his head, every instrument. We'll talk about that in another video. But Beethoven, he gave the last few years of his life writing what he had written early in his life, and that was some string quartets. Beethoven, a genius, a man like no other, a man who overcame many, many obstacles to become the greatest musician in history.